Welcome to Developing the Leader Within podcast, the podcast that brings you leadership insights from the brightest minds shaping our world. Join us as we dive into conversation with trailblazers, innovators, and change makers, spanning every corner of the globe. Get ready to explore new perspectives, gain actionable insights, and become the leader the world needs today. Unleash your potential. Tune into Developing the Leader Within podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Let's embark on this transformative journey together. Developing the Leader Within podcast, leading beyond the limits.
Welcome back, everyone. If you haven't subscribed, please do so right now, as it will help getting our show to others and help us get to our next milestone. Today, we are speaking with Rich Bracken. Rich is a keynote speaker on emotional intelligence, motivation, and executive presence. He is also a fellow outlier, and I am so pleased to have him with me. Rich, welcome to the show.
So good to see you, brother. I appreciate you having me on the show, and kicking off the new year with some emotional intelligence is always a good way to do it.
Absolutely. And I can't wait to get into the topic with folks. We're going to be speaking about leading with emotional intelligence, empowering leaders for 2025 and beyond. But before we get into that conversation, Rich, tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so you touched on the high levels. I'm a emotional intelligence keynote speaker and consultant. I do speak about general motivation and executive presence, and I work with organizations of all sizes, everything from Fortune 10 companies down to startups. And this topic specifically is important to me because it helped me get through some pretty challenging times, battling burnouts, being more resilient, and really just upskilling me as a leader for communication purposes, team building purposes. So once I learned how important and powerful it was, and I have this servant mentality that I want to help people and share the knowledge if it can help, and I'm very abundantly minded. But then also I've got this personality that my dream job is to host The Price is Right. So Drew and George, if you're listening, I'm ready to come in as an understudy. But until that point, I want to help as many people as possible through emotional intelligence and general motivation.
That's amazing. And when we're talking about emotional intelligence in the realm of leadership, we're often challenged there. I believe that we just forget that we're dealing with people, and we are so involved and focused on the processes, on the business dynamics, on the end goals for revenue, that we forget that there's a human person at the end of every ask that we put out there that is dynamic in their own right, right? There are periods in my own life where the dynamics are just so vast and everything is going 1,000 miles an hour in my head that I can't even focus on the things. But as we're trying to prepare leaders in this episode for what's coming up, how can leaders in 2025 leverage emotional intelligence to navigate the rapid technological advancements and changing workplace dynamics effectively?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and the lead up to it is important too, because I think now leaders are tasked more than ever to be more efficient through technology and to be head down in the processes and the flow of things, and they've forgotten to look up at their people. To your point, I think we've become more disconnected, but we're shifting to more of an awareness that we need to be more people focused. So that the shift is there. But I think once AI really started taking over the marketplace and technology really became a competitive differentiator for a lot of organizations, they forgot about the people. So a couple different things that emotional intelligence helps with. Number one, emotional intelligence will drive your performance. The studies show, and I'm, part of my resume is that I'm also the brand ambassador for Talent Smart EQ, which is the number one emotional intelligence consulting and research organization in the world. And a lot of the data that we're finding is around individual performance. So 60% of your performance as an individual, specifically as a leader too, is based on your emotional intelligence. So your knowledge is 40%, your ability to navigate your emotions and navigate those of other people is 60%. So part of that too is that top performers, 90% of top performers have a high EQ, and that results in things like empathy, resilience, the ability to pivot and keep cool under pressure. So when we talk about adaptability, that's key. Also understanding that the human element of technology is more critical than ever. People have been talking about AI taking our jobs for years. AI is not necessarily taking our jobs, it's just shifting the job dynamic. Matter of fact, there was a research done by McKinsey that was saying that by 2030, around 375 million workers in the workplace are going to have some sort of a shift in their role or shift in their description of their job. And so understanding as leaders how we talk with our people about that. It's not necessarily that your job's going away. How do we shift your skill set? And then how do we also communicate effectively with our teams? So it's understanding that our teams are the most important piece of driving this. You can have all the technology in the world, but if you don't have the people to support it, that's where you're going to fall short. And so people that are so laser focused on the technology and forgetting about the people will fall behind their competition eventually.
Wow, 5 years is right there. If you think about
It's
how time flies when you're having fun.
yeah,
So,
exactly.
2030 is around the corner. Something to think about really as leaders. How do we help our folks get in a position where they don't feel like they're about to lose their job, but that they're an actual element in the progression, right? And when you know
Right.
that you're an element, a cog in that wheel, you understand that without it, the wheel's not going to perform well. So great points there. Now,
Mm-hmm.
as we go back to the workforce, new year, diversity is always something that is brought up because not just in what makes us human, but
Mm-hmm.
thoughts and feelings. And I mentioned earlier, I'm a dynamic person, so is everyone else, and we bring so much to the table. But what role does emotional intelligence play in creating more inclusive and diverse work environments? And how can leaders foster a sense of belonging in hybrid or remote teams?
Yeah, absolutely. To the diversity side of things, and really it focuses on empathy and inclusion. The main thing that people don't talk about enough when it comes to this is psychological safety. So understanding that as a high empathetic leader, as a highly emotionally intelligent leader, we are going to be creating more psychological safety with our teams. That's individuals, that's groups, that's two, threes, understanding that we need to provide that ability to have those conversations, to be able to express who we are, to express ideas, no matter what they are, to be able to give your team that is allowing them to be individuals. And some people will say, well, I don't want to open the floodgates for everybody just to be self expressive. Well, at the same time, that's where their skills lie, that's where their value truly lies. Their perspective is everything. So if we're not giving those conversation opportunities or opening those doors to have those conversations, we may be missing out on the next big idea, but also we're protecting our teams. If you're not engaging in those conversations, the likelihood of somebody leaving or leaving on a bad note as well and going out into the marketplace with that bad taste in their mouth for your company because you just weren't a good empathetic listening leader, that's problematic in the long term. Because I have been in that position before where my leaders did not listen to me or did not care, or it was not an empathetic, psychologically safe environment. And so I couldn't express things. And when I left there, I was the first person to tell people, like, oh, well, I knew you worked at such and such company. Would you recommend it? I was like, absolutely not. So the long-term effect and cost on attrition is big there. But when we come to the idea of an inclusive teams actually outperform other teams that are non-inclusive by 80%. So if you think about it, like just give your team the ability to talk, to express ideas and feel safe in that environment, that your teams are going to outperform other teams by 80%. That's worth lending an ear to somebody, or opening up conversations that are more dynamic, and understanding that we have to include the hybrid setting. I know that there's debates all over the place about we got to have our teams in office, or we're making everything fully remote. If you figure out how to work that and not be so restrictive on the in-person or in-office, um, uh, the policies and how we're keeping our teams in place, understanding that we can be more empathetic and we can open that psychological safety virtually as well, and understanding that we have so many people in that position that don't feel connected. So the more empathetic and the more open you are, the more likely you are to get higher performing individuals, whether they are in person or virtual or hybrid. Being able to be that empathetic leader and give people that ability to express themselves, to feel included, to feel part of a team, will drive performance and satisfaction through the roof.
Absolutely. I recall getting my 2024 wrap up on for LinkedIn, and the title that came down as a descriptor to me was The Empath. So I feel real good about
Mm-hmm.
that personally.
Oh, yeah.
But I do know, similar to you, being in an environment where psychological safety was not a thing, right? That
Mm-hmm.
no one
It's
was
so
thinking.
destructive.
And
It's
so
so destructive.
and it was destructive. And to your point, I go on, someone else asks about that particular place, and you're like, no way. I
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't suggest it. Now you go your route, but I would. And so, very great point there for leaders to understand is that it's not just the effect that you have at the moment when you're not having or providing a psychologically safe environment. It's
Mm-hmm.
what happens after and from there. It's like a snowball effect, if you will, or dominoes going down the road. It will eventually affect you.
When I work with teams or organizations or I'm consulting leaders, that's one of the top questions I ask. Like, how would you rate your connectivity and your relationship with your team? And it's a 360 too, because I'll ask them and they may say, "Oh, it's great. Everybody, I'm connected with everybody, and everybody, we have a great relationship." But when I go talk to the people that they work with or that they lead, and there's a different story there, a lot of it comes down to they're just not listening, or they're telling me things without asking me my thoughts or giving a why. And so, some leaders will say, "Well, I don't need to give up that much power." I'm like, it's not power. Power is in the idea that we are creating inclusive teams. And so by just listening, by just creating that psychologically safe space, you are actually having more power as a leader and you're growing your team around you, which actually makes you a better leader. So that listening factor is humongous and so underrated in the workforce nowadays.
And I agree. 6 years ago, I started this podcast venture because of a survey I had put out about leadership. And the topic that came up the most was listen.
Mm-hmm.
They need to listen. And so here we go. 6 years later, we're still talking about that very one topic. Now, when we are in the workplace, it's one thing, but we mentioned that these are people,
Mm-hmm.
and we have gone through the COVID pandemic, everything that everybody suffered all at once, no one was ready for. And there are still lingering. I can tell you myself that I still have some mental health issues
Mm-hmm.
trying to deal with other things when it comes to my emotions and all this other thing. And it has become a thing that now is part of me. Right? It's
Mm-hmm.
part of me until I can get it resolved.
Mm-hmm.
But as mental health becomes a priority, how can leaders use emotional intelligence to promote resilience and well-being within their teams while managing their own?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do want to pause real quick. And number one, applaud you for talking about your own mental health struggles. That's the number one thing that we need to be doing more of is having conversations. And when I go speak at conferences or speak at companies, that's the first thing I talk about is you've got to acknowledge that this is going on. We weren't doing well before the pandemic. We were just hiding it mostly in corporate in America. We were hiding the fact that we were stressed out, that we were burnt out. I shared with you that personally, I got into emotional intelligence because of my own burnout. And so we weren't doing well when when COVID happened. And I think what we don't do enough is that we don't stop and say, you know what? For a couple of years, as a planet, we went through a global mental trauma. Like it was anybody that says, "Oh no, COVID was fine. I was totally fine through the whole thing." They are a bottle of Coke being shaken slowly. Like there is a problem with everyone. This was not normal. So understanding that yes, there are still the after effects of that. And I'll talk about one of those, especially with leaders specifically. But number one, we have to acknowledge the fact that there are still challenges. And there have been and there still will be. It's going to be part of who we are. Work is hard. Life is hard. There's always going to be something that is going to cause stress. And now you add on technology, you add on additional communication, we're more likely to be contacted in some form or fashion, more so now than ever. We are more reachable than ever. So there is stress compounding on top of that too. And even when we talk about like the impact of that stress on business, because some people were like, oh well, people just need to, toughen up or pull up their bootstraps and just get over it. Burnout and stress cost companies $1 trillion a year. $1 trillion. So don't think for one second that it's not a problem that's not relevant, number one, but also impacting your business, number two. And to your point, we've talked about this throughout the whole thing, they're people. And people will, some leaders I'll hear say, well, I've gotten through things, so they should get through things too. Your deal is not their deal. So having some empathy and understanding that you need to listen to your people, acknowledge them, validate their emotions when they have them, that is really critical. And some, again, when I talk with companies, I'll inevitably hear somebody say, well, they can't just take a day off just because they don't feel like it. Well, that could be the leading indicator of a mental health problem that could be compounded later on down the road. So you've got to be more empathetic and listen to those conversations. Those leaders that have emotionally or that are emotionally intelligent that are leading their teams actually lower that stress. So even just acknowledging and having those conversations will reduce your team's stress by 30%. So just understanding that just having those conversations and acknowledging your team and just saying, how are you is the most underrated statement a leader can have in their vernacular. But then when we think about, okay, so we're thinking about our teams and our companies, like leaders are trying to take care of others, but they need to take care of themselves too. Matter of fact, when you talk about the pandemic, especially, the statistic is around 70% of leaders now are facing higher stress, higher mental health problems now more so than the pandemic. So that's escalated since 2022. So when we think about the fact that as leaders, as organizations, we're struggling with mental health and those kinds of problems, but leaders specifically, who are the least likely to acknowledge it, are struggling by 70% greater exasperation of these mental health problems. We need to talk about these things. We need to deal with them. We need to be acknowledging the fact that by admitting that we have a problem or working through a problem, it actually makes us and everybody around us better.
Absolutely. And as we talk about technology, we bring up empathy a lot in this conversation because it really is necessary to have as a leader. You cannot lead effectively without this. You're leading people, right? So, with AI increasingly integrated into decision making, how can leaders maintain strong interpersonal connections and demonstrate empathy in a digitally driven workplace?
Absolutely. And I think what's funny is that sometimes when we talk about emotional intelligence in the workplace, both EI and EQ are used to describe it, emotional quotient and emotional intelligence. So they're used interchangeably. But when I talk about the effect of AI in the workplace and how it needs to be matched with EI, so AI and EI will make your teams more productive. There's data is data, output is output. But if you don't have the people to figure out what is in that data, it's all just facts. But if you don't have somebody that can actually go into the data or go into the process or go into the storytelling aspect of what that AI data output is, then you're not going to have the impact that you're going to want to have as a team, as an organization, with your clients in the marketplace. That is just that emotional understanding is so critical. And actually your clients want you to be more empathetic. I have more conversations. Well, I do another part of my business is that I do client service interviews. So I'll go and talk with clients of companies and just find out what they need from that company so that they can serve better. I call it like the official note passer between these two organizations. Like, do you like me? Check yes or no and tell me why or why not. But a lot of it comes down to emotional intelligence capabilities, listening, likability. And so you could be efficient. That's the marketplace understanding now, is that you're going to be more efficient through AI and through technology. But if you're not likable when you're interacting with clients, if you're not listening and being more understanding as a leader or an individual that's interacting with their clients, you're going to leave a lot of money on the table and leave a lot of problems to be sorted out after the fact. So understanding how you can leverage both AI and EI at the same time is the perfect combination of success moving forward.
And a lot of education needs to be had, right? At least from the leader's perspective, be curious. Be curious enough to say, hey, let me look into this thing and
Yep.
see how I can work with it with my limitations. 'Cause we all have them, and
Yeah.
that's okay. With what you have, see how you can work it into your next year, because here we are. And we're jokingly saying, "Hey, today's officially the last day you should be saying Happy New Year,"
And
right?
do not say
But
Happy New Year past today.
right. So we're in it, right? We're in it, and we're going down this road. It's wise to do this early on as we're navigating the next year. Uh,
Mhm.
when we talk about development, when we talk about dealing with people and how we grow them,
Mhm.
what emotional intelligence skills should leaders prioritize to mentor and develop the next generation of leaders effectively?
Yeah, I would, we've used the word, and I maybe we can do a little fun giveaway thing where if you could tell us how many times we've said empathy in this conversation, you win a prize. Empathy is the number one. It's absolutely critical to understanding how both you act and what you need to improve. So being empathetic with yourself is an underrated skill, but empathy with your team, empathy with your colleagues. So it's not just your team, but how is sales being empathetic to finance, and how is finance being empathetic with legal? Understanding that empathy throughout an organization is critical to success. And it actually is one of the top, if not the top, skills to enhance your leadership. Understanding that you need to be able to engage your teams and understand what they need from a feedback perspective, from a professional development perspective, from a personal development perspective. When you engage your team members that way and just ask them what they need, they are 3.5 times more likely to be engaged. So think about you as an individual. You feel good when somebody cares about you at work, when somebody's interested in what you're doing, what projects you're working on, what goals you have, what path you want to follow. You're going to be more engaged, you're going to be more loyal as well. But understanding too, the last one I would say is an awareness of your emotions. When I talk or give keynotes all the time, I talk about we have a limited emotional vocabulary. We typically go to the what I call the primary colors of emotions, right? Like good, okay, fine, not good, stressed. Like we go some basic things. So understanding that, encouraging that deeper dive of what emotions you feel. And I talk about journaling all the time, or just meditation and visualization. Like what exactly you like, maybe that made me mad, but did it actually trigger some sort of sadness or depression or frustration? Or what are those words that you can go deeper on? And I'm happy to share the emotional vocabulary sheet that I use with my clients with you for your listeners. But that is so key to understand that we have deeper emotions that we should feel. And then curiosity. When we are curious, we have a higher emotional intelligence because we're understanding that we don't know everything, and we're not trying to know everything. We're understanding that people have value. Everybody that you meet knows something that you don't. So if you're not being curious, if you're not asking questions, or you're not asking that follow-up question. Follow-up questions to me are absolute gold in a relationship, whether it's with your team, with your colleagues, with your clients, with your prospects. Asking that next question. Tell me more about that. So if a client comes to you with a problem, tell me more about how that made you feel. Or tell me more about what led up to this. It allows you to understand their emotional path that they've taken with what they're coming to you with. So understanding that follow-up question, tell me more about that. I'm so, acknowledging their emotions. I'm so sorry that you feel that way. I'd like to understand a little clearer how we got to this point. That in of itself, from a leadership perspective, no matter what role you're in, no matter what industry you're in, is critical to fostering those relationships moving forward.
You remind me of an episode I had this last couple of days. I felt like I had been hurt by a person I love very dearly,
Mm.
but I couldn't get to the point where I could say it. And
Mm-hmm.
it had me going nuts. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it was just inside of me, building up, and until I was able to express that,
Mm-hmm.
in whatever particular words I may have used, and then it went away. So when we talk about the dynamics of people and the leaders that are listening, you just never know where your leadership has put somebody in that position.
Mm-hmm.
And you may not know about it, but they're going through a whirlwind of emotions and thoughts and things that they just don't know how to deal with, because now they're talking about their leader,
Yep.
right? And so you have to be empathetic one more time for, for those that are playing
There,
the game.
add one more tick mark on the empathy.
but it is honestly what we are going through as humans, and you have to be in touch with that so that you understand that not everything that we say, do, or express is something that people can swallow easily. And so, as
Right.
leaders, we are in a position of really engaging our folks to make them better. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's why we're there.
oh, absolutely. And two last things that I think are critical for leaders to understand, and you touched on one of them, is that asking for feedback as a leader is it really, really important, if not critical, to your development of your leadership skills, but also the development of the relationship within your teams. And what I always tell people is that when you ask for feedback, and this is with clients or colleagues or team members, anybody that you're asking feedback from, ask them for feedback. When they provide you that feedback, two things happen. Number one, it's nerve-wracking to ask for feedback because you're afraid of what you're going to hear, but it's also nerve-wracking for the individual, especially if there's somebody who reports to you, to give that feedback. So they're in just as much of a nervous position as you are. They're anxious in what they're going to say and how it's going to be taken. The only thing you can say, the only thing you can say, or an iteration of this, is thank you. I appreciate you sharing that with me. You can't battle back. You can't give excuses. You can't justify things. You're asking them for their feedback, and they're in that vulnerable spot. Just say thank you. I appreciate you sharing that with me. You could say I'm now aware of that, and I will work on that more. The other piece of it too, to the emotional awareness and really stopping and understanding and validating our emotions, is that we have to not be so busy. And I'm doing air quotes for those who are listening, but don't be so busy. Block time on your calendar. Block time in the morning, block time at lunch, block time at the end of the day, even if it's 5 minutes, to say, how am I doing? I'm a big Peloton freak, and there was a DT Shaw does this mental visualization of how are you? She asked, how are you mentally? How are you physically? How are you emotionally? If you stop for 5 minutes and ask yourself those questions and be very honest with yourself, you'll discover a lot of things that are going on where previously we tend to have this activity where we say, well, I'll get to that later. I've got to get to the next meeting. That upset me, but I'll unpack that later on. And that just sits and festers. So giving yourself that time to really dive into how that made you feel, what emotions it made you feel, being more specific with the emotion, lets you understand what triggers have been pulled, understanding how you're reacting to things, and maybe the way you reacted is not the best version of yourself or not your favorite version. So how would you react differently? What would you do different next time? And then that understanding in that moment allows you to be a more impactful leader, but also raise your emotional intelligence at the same time.
Well, I tell you, that will set you off on a very good foot if you go down that road for this year. And Rich, I wanted to ask you, what do you have coming up? I know we spoke about a couple of things that you have,
Mhm.
and where can the viewer or the listener follow you or support you?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot going on that may actually be another like bonus episode. Traveling the country and the world, doing keynotes, a lot of coaching as well. So I've been working deeper with companies. So I'll typically come in and do a keynote for a company and then do some consulting on the back end to really carry the habits forward. So tons going on in that space. I'm very excited. The partnership with Talent Smart EQ. I've got access to books and training and assessments for organizations. So I'm building a new page on my website for that. So that's going on. And also, frankly, it's just because I'm a ridiculous individual and I say why not to a lot of opportunities, I'm actually working on a couple of TV shows. So more to come there. But just really dynamic things. And my last thing that I'm working on that I'm really excited about is that I'm working on my first book that I'm over the moon about. I've had two ideas for a long time, and I've just decided I'm just going to do it because there will never be a perfect time to do it. So I'm just attacking it this year, and it's my goal to have it done by this time next year.
Outstanding. Well, I can't wait to get my hands on that book. And congratulations on the TV venture and all the things that you have lined up, folks. We're going to have links to all the places where you can support Rich at as part of the video and show notes. And we hope that you do that. And when he releases his book, that you'll support it. We'll make sure to link that in as well when it comes available. So today's episode is sponsored by the Global Trends Magazine, the Outlier Project, Fantail Services, Southern Sweet and Sassy Coffee, Ascend Meditations, and Chop AI. If you've enjoyed this episode and learned something interesting about the topic covered today, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and let us know by leaving a comment. We're always looking for new ideas and guests that we can add to our show. So if you know someone or have a topic that you would like featured on the podcast or want to sponsor our show, we love to hear about it by emailing us at triadleadershipsolutions@gmail.com. And be sure to tune in next week for another episode where we dissect leadership from another angle. And as we like to end the show, success to you.